Hello, my name's Faye, and after my previous video having talked about the non-fiction books I read in May, I thought it only made sense to also talk about the 5 fiction books I read. I have a really good mix in here, which I think describes quite well how sometimes I have random tastes in books. So I'll just go roughly, chronologically, roughly from worst to best so that we can end on a positive. The first 2 books I read in digital format. The first I got from NetGalley, which was great. It's always nice to have a free book to read. I ended up giving the Printed Letter Bookshop 2 out of 5 stars. This is by an author called Katherine Reay, I believe. I'm not sure about the pronunciation. And the initial plot of this book is my absolute jam. So we follow Madeline, who's sort of 30-ish, and she has some like city job, and then she leaves all that because she has some shit go down, and then she inherits her deceased aunt's bookshop in a small town, and finds herself. This plot is really common, and I really love it. In this one, the sort of more unusual aspect is that the chapters are told from Madeline's point of view and the 2 other female employees of this small bookshop. So we have a range in age and sort of life story, which is nice. But I did find that sort of technical aspect of the book a little bit overused, because quite early on in the novel, one of the characters comments that the other isn't the main protagonist of her own life story, and then those chapters told from the point of view of that character are told in 3rd person, whilst the other chapter is told in 1st person. I thought that was a bit, obvious metaphor there. But this is very much personal taste. I think a different reader would feel very differently about this and identify more with the characters. There is, especially towards the latter half of the book, quite a lot of discussion of sort of spirituality and finding your way in life through faith. And there's also a very traditional depiction of a certain type of romantic relationship, and the sort of worth and importance of marriage, and all of those thoughts. I don't want to call them dated, I don't feel like that's fair, but I don't identify with that line of thought that much, and I sort of wished for one character in the book to just be a little bit different. Even the love interest had like a negative experience and therefore has turned away from practicing medicine and is just working as a gardener, and there was this desire to tie a perfect bow on top of this book. And whilst that is often the case in a sort of contemporary women's fiction, chick lit, whatever you want to call it, I did think this was especially lacking a certain kind of nuance and diversity, a bit more of a modern lens in a way. Still, the next book I read, I liked even less, and I ended up giving this 1 out of 5 stars. I think this is actually quite a hilarious one. This one's called Broken Resolutions by Olivia Dade, and is a romance novella. And I think I'm just learning that novellas aren't for me, even though in a romance novel the plot is limited. We want there to be this happily ever after between usually 2 people, and we want to read about their amazing sex life. You'd think that a novella has enough scope to deliver on those fronts, but in this one, Broken Resolutions, there's a story between a librarian and a famous author and their night spent in the library after a singles mixer. All of this I thought was just very convenient. I thought the inevitable drama, it wasn't even like really like an interesting thing, like problem for the couple to overcome. Drama was really unnecessary and just made the main character, the female, the librarian, not only unlikable but also just really like unrealistic. And they talk about like these huge emotions, and essentially they spend, you know, a long night with each other. I think it's fair enough to talk about how much you had the hots for each other in that night, but like to actually talk of sort of soulmate, love of my life proportions, want to build my life around you proportions after a one night stand, basically, I thought was a bit blown up, and it's just not great. I read it originally because it had a librarian as a main character and it was set in a library, and I was getting really excited for the Borrow-a-thon, which is a readathon that goes on once or twice a year. This year it was in May, targeted at reading borrowed books, and the one prompt that is a reoccurring in this readathon is reading a book set in a library. It's a very long-winded explanation for why I read this novella. It was just a novella, so it didn't rob much of my time, but I would let this one slide. It's also the first in like a series, and yeah, I won't carry on with that series. But on to bigger and better things. The last 3 books I want to talk about are all amazing books. So the first is A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars, I believe. And this is a short little book that, because it was quite challenging to read, still did take me a little while. This is the story of Alex, a 15-year-old in the beginning of this book, I believe, teenager, and his group of friends, and all the quite terrible crimes that they get into. And then in the second part of this book, he ends up being incarcerated for those crimes, and the prison sets out to treat his violent criminal tendencies. Trying not to give too much away here. I didn't know much about this. I basically only had sort of a few like movie stills in my head from when this was turned into a movie, and a sort of slightly flawed expectation that this was very much about old-fashioned psychiatric care in the 20th century. But that's only a small part of this. The reason why I found this so challenging is what many of you possibly already know. I didn't going into this. That there's I think it's called NADSAT or something like that. I'm like glancing to my notes. I think they call it NADSAT, which is like a youth speak. And the whole book is written in this made up sort of pidgin English, like it sort of borrows from Russian terms, sort of Cockney slang, but then sort of also Shakespearean grammar, and it really is quite difficult to get into at first. I read the first page totally unprepared, like, oh, like this is going to be tough, but you do get into it, and I think that is one of the most masterful things about this book. That essentially Anthony Burgess almost makes up like it's not a new language, but definitely like a new dialect, and you still somehow get into it. I did look up a few words, I must admit. There's a fun like personal website someone made with a sort of small little dictionary, but you do get into it. That's not necessary. You just have to persevere, and after sort of 5 pages or so, you slowly start getting into it. There is so much, though, in this small little book. So not just is it about psychiatric care and sort of behaviouralist attitudes to conditioning humans, but there's a whole discussion about free will and whether it's better to be authentically bad than to be good just because you're being forced to be good, if you're not actually making the decision to be good or bad, if that then essentially makes it different in quality. It talks about a sort of prison system, a police state, and the difference between sort of youth and adulthood in a way. it was a really, really good book. There are some very tough passages to read about. So stay clear of this if you do not want to read about violence and rape and murder on the page. And it is sensationalist in a way, but I feel like that's purposefully so. I feel like the book does live from these really, really crass depictions of violence, because then he manages to show how crass the other side can also be. This whole prison system dealing with the main character. The main character's not supposed to be likable. I mean, I don't see how he would be. And still, you manage to criticize how he's being handled. It's really clever. I can't really justify why I didn't give it 5 out of 5 stars. Possibly because I wanted more of a bang in the end, and I do believe there is an alternate version. The British and the American apparently differ, or the book and the movie differ, something like that. So I will now watch the movie. I am very interested to see how this was turned into a movie, also because I can't imagine how they were able to show certain scenes on the screen. Blows my mind, that thought. Then I also gave 4 out of 5 stars to Atonement by Ian McEwan. I've read a few of his books and largely enjoyed them. Atonement is one of his sort of earlier works, one of his probably most well-known ones. I haven't read it though. This centres around Bryony Tallis, is that how you pronounce that name? I think she's 13 in the beginning of the book, and she is the daughter in an upper-class British family in the 30s, and she describes this summer in 1935, the misunderstandings, a family tragedy in a way that results from it, and we have the time period from the sort of mid-30s to early Second World War told from her point of view. Again, I'm really pussyfooting around this one because I don't want to spoil too much, because the way the story is crafted, the way Ian McEwan transitions between different time periods, and then the sort of the bracket around the beginning of the book and what is then the final chapter is really intelligent. Not only is this a sort of historical war fiction, but it's also a family saga, it's also a sort of coming of age story, but it's also on a sort of more meta level, a discussion on writing and storytelling. It's really clever. It's a little slow in the beginning, in the middle, sorry. I thought that was a bit dragged out, to be honest. But I had a few moments where I had to close this book and take a breath, because Ian McEwan is so incredibly good at crafting a story that isn't the most fantastic and loud, but it's so close to human emotion and so important for the individual characters that I find it sometimes quite difficult to push on, because I really, really feel for them, in the story, and without wanting to give away what the sort of tragedy in this book is, you know, it's not hugely important on a sort of global level, but it changes the life of every character in this story, and I would really urge you to read this one. I think it's beautifully written. It's not good for a reader who wants to have really likable characters. I was sort of flicking through a few reviews of this, and some dislike the voice of the teenage girl Bryony, but she's a teenage girl. She's immature in many ways. And I didn't have an issue with that. And the conclusion towards the end of the book, if anyone's read this, then you'll know what he decides to do with the structure of the book is just so great. I'll put it away so I don't give too much away. And then the final book I read, not the final book, but the final one I want to talk about, was my favourite book of the month. And I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, which doesn't happen every day. And that was James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. I have not read anything by James Baldwin before. I initially just got this because I thought these editions are so pretty. So Penguin does this great love series. So they're all love stories in some form. And this is the 17th in that series, if, you know, that interests you. And this is the story of David, who is a young American who is, you know, trying to discover who he is living in Paris. And he meets the Italian man Giovanni, and it's their love story. And it's very thin, so I don't want to give too much away. But I believe this was first published in 1956, something like that. And it's such a timeless story. It really is. The depiction of a certain group of sort of night-dwelling folk who are drawn together because of certain dissatisfactions in their life is just so great. Even though sort of the 50s in Paris are really sort of palpable, I can very easily transfer that into present day. David's struggles with deciding, for lack of a better word, whether he is homosexual or heterosexual, because there is that clear distinction for him, is really moving. And the actual story isn't even that important. This was a book where I wrote out quotes that I just found so perfectly written, and just, I don't know, like all these emotions in this book you've either felt before or you are terrified of feeling ever. And I just thought it was great. This is really often discussed as like one of the sort of important gay love stories, and it is, but it's also just an amazing story about a young man living in Paris trying to find himself. So I actually recommend this to absolutely anyone and everyone. And it was the first James Baldwin I ever read, like I said, and now I want to read more. So that's just a really great find for the month. Those were the 5 books I read in May. Please read Giovanni's Room, if anything. It's so good. And I'll talk to you very soon. Bye.